This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Eddie Glaude, who is James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. In addition to numerous scholarly and public-facing essays, he is the author of a number of books, including most recently An Uncommon Faith, A Pragmatic Approach to the Study of African American Religion from 2018, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own from 2020, and We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For from 2024. He also maintains a Substack newsletter under the title A Native Son. In this conversation, we discuss the place of religious studies in the field of Black studies, the impact of pragmatism, prophetic work, and political thinking on reckoning with Black life, and the complex methods, critical frames, and sensibilities that comprise the field. Eddie Glaude, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's great to see you, John. It's wonderful to have an opportunity to talk with you.
Well, I'm so happy that you found time to be on the podcast. You know, I was thinking when my colleague Ashley Newby and I formulated this project about a number of people, and you were really at the top of the list, whose work as a public-facing writer, critical essay and book writer, political critic, doing so much of the work that I think the imperatives of Black studies are all about. And so it just feels a little bit extra special to have a chance to talk with you today. I have a lot of respect for the work that you do, that you write, and your public stances and all of that. But really, I just, your place in Black studies, I think, is really interesting. So I look forward to our conversation, and thanks in advance for all this time and thoughtfulness.
No, thank you. Thank you. I'm humbled by that. I really appreciate it. It means a lot.
So I want to, of course, talk to you about your sort of vision of Black studies, how you see your own work in relation to it, and so forth. But before that, I wanted to start with a more personal question, just invite you to narrate for us how you came to the study of Black life. You know, what compelled you about that study, what sustains you in that, and what drew you to the field of Black studies?
You know, that's a really fascinating question for me. In so many ways, it's so profoundly personal. You know, as a country boy growing up on the coast of Mississippi, there were just certain questions that pressed themselves upon me. You know, I remember as a young page shelving books in the library at Pascagoula Regional Library and coming across the first edition of Manning Marble's Race, Reform, and Rebellion, you know, the second Reconstruction book, and sitting in between the shelves and reading it from cover to cover and shall we say, sneaking the book out of the library, checking it out, never returning it. And how that story of the mid 20th century struggle struck me. Right. And then of course going to Morehouse and being socialized into this idea of what it meant to be a race man. Given the I remember I was a freshman and thinking I was all of that, and this guy hands me the autobiography of Malcolm X and says, you know, you think you're that smart, but you don't really know who you are, and gave me the book, and I went back to Graves Hall and read it from cover to cover, and I still have my goatee to this day because it was a kind of a conversion experience for me. And we started the Organization of African American Consciousness, which was a reading group of folk throughout the AU Center reading all of this Black nationalist literature. And so it was in that kind of journey of really trying to understand three issues: history, right? The history that shapes me, identity, who do I take myself to be, coming out of a working class family in Mississippi where silences were more pronounced than stories. What wasn't said was as important as what was said. So trying to figure out who I was and then what I could do, the issue of agency. So history, identity, and agency, becoming the kind of three anchors of how I would then come to the study of Black folk in the U.S. and around the globe. And of course, all of this begins as I'm being shaped politically, John, in the Black nationalist tradition. I cut my political teeth in that tradition and trying to make sense of myself in light of those resources
Mhm.
and who I would be as I came out on the other side, right? And obviously who was waiting for me on the other side was Cornell West,
Hmm.
and everything was transformed in that encounter. So yeah.
Yeah, I just have to say on a personal note, Graves Hall was also the freshman dorm for my son. So it's there at
Hey,
Graves Hall. I'm
it's
like,
the
hey,
best one
yeah.
out there. Yeah, yeah. Not when I was there, but it is certainly historic. It's the first building.
I believe they claim to be undefeated in dorm wars, which are now banned from campus. But anyway, there's also something really interesting in listening to sketch out this journey. Is both the taking a book off a shelf and being given a book, right? In response to what you said, this. In southern coastal southern Mississippi, certain questions, I think you put it, so certain questions are asked, but then these books both appearing on a shelf and appearing in a hand being given to you, and
Yeah.
that sort of privacy of study, but also the publicity of the questions posed to you. Yeah, I love that.
And that's a wonderful juxtaposition, right? And I never really thought about it, but it makes sense that books would be at the center of the story,
Hmm.
given how important they were for me, and they are for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure those librarians, although they may have looked for the book, if they knew that the path it put someone on, that's what those libraries are there for. So
Exactly.
my sister is the just stepped down president of the American Library Association. So if she hears this, she'll probably give me a call for your contact information for a return. But
Exactly. I have to make a donation to the regional library. Exactly.
well, that's always worth it. Well, let me ask you then a really broad question, and that's to get inside your imagination of the field of Black studies, where you've worked for a really long time. And I specifically want to ask you how you imagine the field of Black studies in light of its origin story, which has such an interesting tension built into it, right? There was, of course, the founding of Black studies in the late 1960s, early 1970s was in part a response to the failure of the disciplines to have taught the study of Black life in any kind of significant way. And so building that sense of an intellectual tradition, its appreciation, its production, reproduction, and transformation is really at the heart of the intellectual project of Black studies. But of course, the 1960s and early 1970s are this moment of really important militant post-civil rights Black liberation agitation, which was reconfiguring the relationship between intellectual work and liberation politics and those imperatives. So it has these two kind of imperatives to it, right, of political intervention and transformation, right, as Marable said, prescription, as a prescriptive element. But it's also this deeply intellectual project about developing and appreciating a sense of tradition. We're 50-something years out from that. And so, I sort of ask you, how are you thinking of the field at this moment, 2024, but especially in light of its origins, which are both distant but also very close to us?
Yeah, yeah. I've always struggled with this, and I've come out of two very distinct strands. I got my master's degree at Temple in African American Studies, the first PhD program, and it's Afrocentrism, it's cultural nationalism. So it traces its origins to Karinga and other places in that regard. So we could tell the story of its development through San Francisco State or through Yale and Cornell. I mean, how, and those are very different trajectories, right? Tell the story of Black studies from the vantage point of HBCUs or from the vantage point of the Ford Foundation. Those are very two different spaces, but they're all so important. Yeah, but they're all so important to the field. And so I think what we've seen is the ongoing work of institutionalization and incorporation. What does it mean for advocates of the field to assert its significance, its role, its centrality to the education of American students, of students generally in American higher ed? And so once that move was made, right, then I think the development of the field was kind of impacted by pressures of professionalization, by standards of excellence, and measures of deficiencies.
Yeah.
Um, there's a sense in which once we sought institutionalization within these spaces, right, it impacted in very clear ways the idea of the field as an insurgent, right,
Hmm.
space,
Hmm.
right. That doesn't mean that the people who inhabit African American studies or Africana studies or Black studies, and that nomenclature is part of the history because the demand is constantly made for us to make ourselves intelligible to the institutions within which we work.
Hmm.
And we're often doing that by way of shifting our names
Yeah. Yeah.
to account for what we're doing. But I think what's fascinating is that as individual faculty members, we don't stop being political,
Hmm.
but there's no necessary relationship between what we study and actually being engaged in transformative politics. So if you are in African American studies and you're looking at, right, Coptic manuscripts, right, there's no
Yeah.
reason to judge that somehow you're not in Black studies because it has no direct kind of correlation to movement building.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so basically what we've been doing, I think, over the course of the history of the field since the 1960s is expanding the nature of what constitutes, right, doing Black studies,
Hmm.
right? Trying to capture that kind of what we might describe as methodological promiscuity,
Yeah.
right?
I like that.
In a way that looks attractive institutionally, that
Hmm.
can manage itself institutionally, right? And so it's been an interesting journey on so many different levels, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The name question is funny. My department just renamed itself from African American Studies to African American Africana Studies, and I feel like there's a book to be written about these conversations about names. Which it's meetings and colleagues, and people get tense and have commitments to certain things.
Yeah,
But the deeper meaning, as you say, both that becoming intelligible to institutions, which is so much part of being in the field, period, but also trying to say something about the subject matter, right? What do we represent? What do we want to represent? How do we face our students? How do we face the world? So that name is there. And also, and I've said this in a number of these podcasts, this is a funny question for me to ask in 2024, because that juxtaposition between a sort of direct political action and intellectual exploration and teaching, I don't know how much, especially in 2/3 of the states in this country, we can really say that the teaching of basic history and literature is somehow outside direct political intervention. I mean, we're finding
right,
our stuff being banned left and right.
right. And I think there's a sense in which politics takes place in a number of different arenas at a number of different registers.
Hmm.
And we have to understand um, uh, what the production of knowledge entails and how our point of entry um, um, shifts the center of gravity and the
Hmm.
political implications of that. It doesn't look like movement politics of the mid 20th century, but it has political implications in terms of how we think about the work of institutions of higher learning.
Hmm.
But it varies. It's going to vary in its intensity. It's going to vary in the subject matter, and that's part of the challenge. I remember when we were building the Department of African American Studies here at Princeton. Then President Shirley Tillman asked me, "What's the big idea in African American studies?" And I responded by asking her a question: "What's the big idea in English?"
Yeah.
And I said, it all depends on who you talk to, right? If you're
Hmm.
talking with the Chaucer scholar, you're going to get a different answer. If you're going to talk to someone who's working at the cutting edge of post-structuralism and literary criticism, you're going to get a different answer.
Yeah.
And so part of what I was trying to do in that moment was to insist on the variegated nature of the field,
Hmm.
of the various voices, various streams that constitute our conversation, and the need for the institution to recognize that complicated bibliography in the institutional structure.
Hmm.
And that's a hard conversation to have with people who think that this genetic predisposition, right? That
Mhm.
somehow because we began as an insurgent movement, we must always be that. And I think that loses sight of what institutionalization and incorporation has meant, absorption and incorporation has meant for the field.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this very question about the sort of political responsibilities of Black studies as a field, as individual professors or departments, I mean, for me, for all the reasons you just outlined, it's such a fraught question because I've also taught in philosophy departments. That was never a question for us.
Never.
While we were doing extremely political work in the sense of reproducing in our courses the idea that only Europeans had done philosophy, but I'll put that aside. That's why I'm not in philosophy anymore.
Exactly.
So let me ask you about your work a little bit. Shift in getting a sense of your imagination of the field, and now shifting to your own orientation. Your work has always been the mix of religious studies, cultural history, literature, and of course, intervention in contemporary political issues. And, these are so many wings of the field of Black studies that when I think put together, you've been able to just generate so many potent insights for us. And I'm curious, when you think about your own sort of political or intellectual constellation, how you see that in relation to the past of Black studies, how it sort of fits in the tradition, but also the kind of new horizons you see it opening up.
I think it goes back to a phrase I used earlier, and that is the kind of methodological promiscuity. I mean,
Hmm.
you think about one of the texts of the field, The Souls of Black Folks, and you think about Du Bois drawing on history and of the dawn of freedom, the sociology of religion, the sociology of leisure, right? The way in which he's thinking about cultural studies with the sorrow songs, how literary short story, figures with of the coming of John, the lynching parable, right? The ways in which he's thinking about material culture, and the like. So when we look at the souls of Black folk, we see, right, this kind of modernist intervention, to be crude about it,
Hmm.
um, that demands that if we're going to understand the complexity of Black life, we're going to have to come at it from a number of different directions,
Hmm.
right? And for me, religion, which is always the great scandal of Black studies, right? It
Hmm.
constitutes the great scandal because um, there's a kind of acknowledgement of the centrality of religious practices to Black life in the United States and across the globe. But there's also a kind of secularism that defines the field because of its, or shadows the field because of its origins, right, in Black power, right, which is kind of this secularized move where religion, Black Christianity, and more specifically, or Black Protestantism is held at arm's length.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating moment. So I come to the field by way of these religious practices, and I'm trained as a philosopher of religion, a Dewey scholar, but I'm trained by Cornell West,
Hmm.
and and Al Raboteau, the dean of African American religious history, and Jeffrey Stout. And so there's just a certain set of questions around history, identity, and agency that aren't reducible to any particular method, that requires a kind of um, a bricolage approach,
Hmm.
right, where I'm reaching for things. It's not interdisciplinarity. That word gets you into all sorts of trouble. But bricolage as a way of understanding the complexity of the subject matter.
So let me ask you about that term, bricolage. I find that term so interesting. Maybe say a bit about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's where we draw on a variety of traditions in order to find resources to understand the complexity of the subject matter in view. We
Hmm.
could call it bricolage. We could think about it as quilting, this patchwork approach, the mosaic kind of approach, right? However we want to think about it, right? And the idea is for me, and particularly coming out of the Princeton Department of Religion as a PhD in the subfield of religion, ethics, and politics, there is this, constant effort to think historically about philosophical questions that have cultural and political significance. And that kind of thread requires um, a kind of precociousness, a kind of an eye towards a vast or wide body of literature in order to make sense of what you're doing in front of you. So, I can remember in my first book, Exodus, I'm in the archive asking questions of historical documents that come out of my reading of John Dewey, but is shaped by the way in which I'm reading the British cultural studies folks, right? The arc of which is to explain to Cornell why his view of Black nationalism is wrong. So, it's a kind of weirdness, as it were, that I think is actually at the center of what we do in Black studies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you use that word, I was thinking of Glissant's Poetics of Relation, where he says this sort of bricolage as a spatialization of the temporality of creolization or Creole.
Right.
Right. And it makes for a weird sense of mixture, right? So we're not thinking about like direct lines of sort of imperial influence, but instead this sort of emergent, out of bits and pieces, this emergent portrait or decoration and dynamic.
Exactly.
I think it's so liberatory. It's been so liberatory for me. I'm somebody who came from a discipline. I think religious studies in some ways has always been, a little bit of a multidisciplinary discipline.
Right. Because, at the heart of religious studies and in some ways at the heart of Black studies is this troublesome concept, religion. And so it houses within a religion department, you could have archaeologists, anthropologists, sociologists, philosophers, historians, right? And what brings us all together is this subject, is this term, this vexed term. And so what does it mean to talk about a methodology that defines the study of religion? That would be odd for scholars in the field. So so it was a natural move for me.
And I think it's really, the way you started off your comment about coming through religious studies and into Black studies, or the sort of crossroads of those two. I think you're right. I think there is this really peculiar relationship of the study of religion and Black studies, and it's very strange in some ways, especially in the African American context. But I think that's true, and it reminds me, just to be intra-podcast about it, of the conversation I had with Jay Carter, talking about, for him, he was talking about the church as one of the primary places of what, sort of after Moten, we've started to call Black study. The church reading group, the political organization, the community engagement, outreach, hosting, welcoming strangers, and so on. It's in that way. When Jay was saying that, I was so struck by this idea of how did religion become this sort of thing that I think you and a handful of people really end up pushing the horizons of Black studies. But you push it through in this case in a relation to religious studies that seems so central to the experience.
Right. I mean, think about going back to Du Bois. I mean, he says that religion is, predate, African American churches predate the Black family, and the way in which whether it's in the Philadelphia Negro or in the actual study around Black religion, or in the chapter in Souls, which was published in 1900, just a year after Philadelphia Negro, Du Bois is treating the church as a social institution, as the site for Black civil society. It is the soil out of which Black civil society emerges. So it would make sense that as a central institution, that it would anchor how we think about, the experiences, the doings and sufferings of these folk, if we're focused in a U.S. context. And of course, I think a similar move can be made in the Caribbean and other places. But what's interesting is that methodologically, when we think about Black studies in relation to Black power, let me say not methodologically, but historiographically, when we tell the story about Black studies and its relationship to the political movement of Black power and the languages, the theoretical lenses that shape Black power, right? There's an attempt to engage whether it's the influence of Marxist or Pan-Africanism or the like, there's a distancing from the languages of religion as a way of accounting for there's an effort to create new forms of piety, thinking about Karinga and the Yes movement. So there's this ongoing effort to engage in apologetics, an attempt to translate the Black prophetic church tradition into the idiom of Black power. That's James Cone's Black liberation theology, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this vexed relationship to this subject that's at the center of Black life in the U.S. context. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting story to tell.
Yeah, no, vexation is, I think it's a really important critical concept, but it's one that doesn't get talked about. But in these moments, it kind of is the only word for these things.
Indeed.
And I often think about, not to make this about me, but I think about, the two texts that got me interested in the world, the life of ideas. And I'm not a religious person, nor do I do religious studies, but were In the Parish of the Poor. Aristide's book absolutely changed my life, as well as Gustavo Gutierrez's book on Job.
Yeah.
And I went to a Jesuit school, in case you can't tell. But that orientation that has so many elements to it that are political, cultural, historical. So,
right.
And maybe sort of extending this, what you just said, being trained in religious studies, which does have a particular kind of training, like any doctoral training, and then spending so much of your career both in religious studies and in Black studies. I'm curious how that movement from something like a discipline to something that's methodologically and even textually promiscuous, as you put it, how you see that as impacting your writing and thinking, but also your classroom, how you think about teaching, how you think about setting up the encounter of ideas for students.
Well, it was an easy transition for me because religious studies, for me, the point of entry was Cornell's Prophesied Deliverance.
Yeah.
Right. So, it's
that is a direct path.
Yeah, it's a vestibule, right? You go through it and boom, and everything comes, the kinds of questions I asked, my approach, right? The way in which I read is really kind of shaped by the three people I mentioned earlier. And Cornell is at the center of it, and Rabbitoh and Stout are right there shoulder to shoulder with it.
Mm-hmm,
and so it was an easy transition for me. And so my students are constantly kind of confronted with a set of historical realities framed by a set of philosophical, or what might be a better way of putting it, normative questions about the archive in front of us. And so how do I then train my students to read deeply? Cornell used to say to me all the time as a graduate student, brother, we got to historicize, contextualize, and pluralize. And that move, right, of course, comes out of the Marxist tradition, but it also has deep roots in the pragmatist tradition as well, shapes how I read text. And so when I curate a course, that's all a syllabus is a form of curation. The idea is to have my students encounter the archive, and then with a set of eyes or lenses that will allow them to ask questions. Because there's always, whenever I'm in the historical archive, there's always a presentist preoccupation driving my attention to whatever comes into view, right? Otherwise you get lost in it, right? Otherwise you get lost. And so it was an easy move. It was an easy move because of the nature of the training. And so when Cornell West and I came back to Princeton, and we were both in the religion department, we were having a blast, and we both picked up and moved into African American studies, and then I played a role in institutionalizing African American studies here at Princeton.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's it helps when you're sort of I don't know what you would call it, like a your pivot point or cornerstone text is one that's already that path laid out.
I remember telling my early graduate students like Melvin Rogers and Jonathan Walt, read the footnotes and prophesy. That's where we start. Right. Yeah. And once you get there, you're not in any particular field. You're imagining and constructing yourself as an intellectual at that point. And so that's been the orientation all along.
I always tell my students start with the footnotes, actually. Some of them, it's interesting, a couple of them have sort of, in a moment of honesty, have said, isn't that cheating? Isn't that stealing their sources? I was like, no, we put them there for you to go. It's
Exactly.
partly to say this is where it comes from. It's partly to be like, here is the sort of underground plumbing of many projects.
And,
right?
to be honest with you, John, that's how I came to my different reading of Dewey. So I'm reading the footnotes in Prophesy, and it sends me to Bernstein and Rorty, and I start reading them, and then I read Dewey more, the primary, and I'm like, wait a minute, Cornell's reading is too Rortyan. My reading of Dewey's not that. They've made the linguistic turn and left behind the concept of experience. I don't want to do that. And, so,
I love that.
I can only get there by going through the footnotes. So.
Yeah, it's a lot of confessions and footnotes about what's going on in the body of the text. Well, let me ask you a sort of big speculative question about Black studies, thinking about the past 5 decades or so. What do you think Black studies has done particularly well, and what is something you think it has not done particularly well?
It's a hard question to answer, but I would say this, that we're also we're victims of our success. Before Black studies, no one was really teaching African American literature in English departments, or African American history wasn't a robust subfield in history departments, or African American politics. African American. In all of these. So in traditional disciplines, we've made inroads, right? And it has led institutions to ask, given that this subject matter is a constitutive part of many of the traditional fields, why do we need Black studies? And that's a victim. We're a victim of our success in that regard. I think we haven't done a good job of articulating the nature of the field itself. And what are fields? What are disciplines? But they're nothing but conversations had over time. That's what bibliographies are. And part of what we haven't done, because we're constantly responding to pressures, material pressures, right? Justifying ourselves to the universities, having to fight over FTE lines, being able to hire faculty so that we can reproduce ourselves in light of the natural cycles of any academic unit. We haven't given voice, I think, to the complexity of that bibliography over time, right? One of the things we argued here at Princeton, we said we were African American studies, or we could have easily been Black studies. And one of the reasons why we wanted to stick with the name is because we wanted to say that African American studies has always been about more than just simply the U.S. nation state. Bibliography has always been about, not only the folks here in the U.S., but across the diaspora, and of course, including the continent. And so part of, I think, our challenges involves, right, really communicating to administrators who are really sometimes very ignorant of what we do, of the complexity of that conversation. And what does it mean to represent that conversation, that complexity structurally? Right? So that is captured, right? And not reducible to personality or whom's, you get a leader whose energy is off the charts, and then suddenly you get a transition and things aren't what they are or what they were. But to actually reflect the complexity of that conversation in the very ways in which the field is constituted at a particular institution. We need to do a better job of that, I think.
Yeah, not to build too much ambition into this podcast series, but that is part of, I think, what Ashley and I were thinking in conceiving this series is let's start a series of conversations that really takes account of like how we imagine the field and its differences, but also, you hear these different visions, you start to think differently, but difference can be that moment of expansiveness, hopefully.
Oh, absolutely. I keep telling folks all the time, when they talk about, say, Temple or San Francisco State or Princeton or Harvard or Yale or University of Maryland, right? It's like, well, look, if you think about philosophy departments, you got philosophy departments that are deeply analytic. You have philosophy departments that are continental in their orientation. Now the subject matter is covered, but the tendency, right? depends on who's on the ground. So if you're in a sociology department full of quantitative folks, it's going to have a quantitative orientation. It doesn't, but they're going to have to cover certain things. So there are tendencies within our field that some people just refuse to recognize, right? Because they want to flatten out that complex bibliography. They want to just tell the story of our, that there's only one tributary, not just one river, no tributaries at all, right? And I just think that's wrong on a whole different number of levels.
Yeah, I mean, look, traditions obviously have continuity to them, but they also have deep dispute. And it's always funny when they think about anyone would say anything about the continuity of the African-American intellectual tradition. I'm like, I mean, there's obviously Du Bois and Washington, but boy, those letters that Wright and Hurston were sending to each other. I mean, these are things that make you wince a little bit when you read. I get a little intimidated by those folks. I'm like, I wouldn't want to be in this dispute, but disputes make traditions as well, and honoring that and cultivating that. I like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So let me pick up. I really like this phrase because it segues really nicely into this next question about the being victims of our own success, which I've had this question about the future of Black studies, and maybe this is a kind of deeply futurist, almost science fiction-y kind of moment. But thinking about, how would we even measure the success of Black studies in a long expanse of the future, right? You say victims of our success. I think that says something about what an impact Black studies has had on the disciplines, that, the failure of the disciplines is part of the origin of the field, right? Is actually the success of Black studies eventually to have so transformed the field of Black study, or field of the disciplines, right, to the study of Black life in the disciplines, that Black studies in some sense has fulfilled its mission? Or is the future of Black studies and its success to have articulated, and it sounds like this is where the direction you were going, to have articulated its own particularity in a way that becomes undigestible and unassimilable by disciplines, even if they are committed to the study of Black life?
Right. I think it's more the latter. I think it's this idea of what does it mean to explicitly orient oneself within this complex conversation had over time. Mm-hmm. Understanding that one identifies not with particular methods, but rather it's the subject that drives one's research agenda. So I'm very clear about myself as a Black studies scholar, right? Mm-hmm. Not as a religionist who studies Black people. Mm-hmm. And that difference matters, because part of the way in which I understand myself intellectually and the trajectory of my work, my research agenda, and the tradition in which I consider myself a part, is that there are a certain set of questions mm-hmm. that animate what I'm grappling with. And that's part of that conversation. Yeah. I'm not dipping in and dipping out. It's not just the fact that I'm studying Black people that mm-hmm. situates me. It's the identification with the way in which I'm asking the question, being in conversation with previous ways of asking certain questions. And I think that is important. Mm-hmm. It is critical. But I think it's part of the work that we need to do in order to further institutionalize our field. And that is to really, really give voice to the complexity of that conversation had over time. Because it's a very different orientation. Yeah. If I'm just a historian who studies Black people, mm-hmm. as opposed to I'm in the archive trying to figure out some things in relation to this question, these questions, and I'm bringing certain training to bear, right? That's different.
I love that characterization, because I think the sort of default mode that comes out of the dominance of the disciplines in university life and intellectual life has been to identify some set of methodologies shared. But I really love, this is the philosopher in me too, this orientation around the idea of the question. I really love that. Thank you.
Right. And to me, I think that the question or the questions, think going back to that text, going back to that, think about that moment. How does it feel to be a problem? It's a question. to which I seldom answer a word, but then he answers it, right? In a very fascinating way with a wide range of resources, right? So what's the question that animates your self-understanding, the question that animates your approach, right? And how you answer that, right, settles your feet.
I love that. So as a final question around this question of the question, perhaps, in this moment, in the field of Black studies, what is the question you think we should all be asking? What is the thing that we should all be thinking about?
It varies depending upon who you talk to,
Well, it is September 20th at 10:55 a.m. East Coast time, so we can mark this.
You're talking to me. Yes. And so, for me, I'm obsessed because I'm an Americanist, and I'll admit it. I'm obsessed with the question of Black studies and democracy. Right? How are we thinking about democratic norms? How are we thinking about democratic principles in light of the experiences of the people that matter most to me? And I'm thinking about that question in light of the challenges that Afro-pessimism presents. I'm not saying that Afro-pessimism should be at the forefront, but the challenge it presents is something that we have to grapple with and answer. And my answer is found in the very ways in which I mine resources for reimagining democracy itself within the traditions in which I work. So that's me in some ways. And I would say too, what I've decided to do with my own work, John, is as I've become more public facing, I've had various stages of my career, kind of narrow academic conversations, the president of the American Academy of Religion. Now I'm this pundit, and if folk only know me, but it's like knowing Cornel West only by way of Race Matters.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense, right? But I Black Studies has offered me resources for thinking about my writing differently, right? To reach for a kind of prose that captures what the stories that are swirling around in my head. But all of it is driven by trying to provide an answer to those who want to say that the world as it is constituted, is bound up with a kind of anti-Blackness that constrains how we respond to it. I want to inhabit that differently, and read the resources differently. I think that's kind of jumbled, but that's where I am.
Not jumbled at all. I really love that. It's a great place to end because it puts, I think, in some ways, the most serious Black studies question right at our front step, which is, what does it mean to live in an anti-Black world if we take live seriously? Love that.
Boom.
Well, Eddie, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your thoughtfulness in this. This has been extremely interesting. I can't wait for people to listen to it and get some ears on it. It's really compelling stuff, raises a lot of questions, reframes so many things in Black studies in productive and exciting ways. So thank you for your time, but really thank you for offering some really, really interesting reflections.
Thank you, Brother John. Thank you for everything that you and Ashley are doing. I really appreciate you both.
Oh, I appreciate that. I will send that on to her as well. All right. Well, take care and have a good rest of your day.
You too, Doc.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.